Supabase comes with very powerful built-in Auth system, and when you combine this system with Next.js 13, you will have a cutting-edge application with authentication systems in a second. Let me show you how we can do this. Okay, let's start with what we are going to build today. In our application, we have a simple login page where user can log in with their GitHub account. When user click this button, they will be redirected to the home page. And in the home page, they can easily log out like this. And when they logged out, they will be redirected to the login page. And if they try to go to home page without login, they will be redirected to login page as well, which means that they cannot reach our application without authentication. Okay, cool. To create this application, first we need to install some packages. The first package is the JavaScript client of Supabase. You can easily install this package with this command. And once you finish installing this package, you need to install another package called Supabase/Auth helpers Next.js. And after you finish installing these packages, you need to set your environment variables. You can find your environment variables from your dashboard, project settings, API, and you can get your URL from here and your public key from here. The names are important. You need to set your environment variables with the same name because Supabase client will look these environment variables with these names. Okay, cool. Now we can start build our application. We will create 3 different Supabase client in our application. First one is server client, which will be used in server-side data fetching in components like server components or route handlers. The second one is browser client. With this client, we will fetch data in browser, in client components. And the last one is middleware client. With this client, we will refresh user session when user navigate through our application. Okay, let's start with server client first. To create our clients, we will first need to create a utils folder. In this utils folder, we can create a file called supabase-server.ts. And in this file, we will be importing this helper function, create server component Supabase client from the Auth helper. And with this helper function, we will create our server client and we will pass cookies and headers from next headers, because the client will use these cookies to recognize user who make requests, and if they are authenticated, their access token will be provided with the request, which means that they can fetch data in a secure way. If the data is protected by row-level security, the user can reach with their access token. Remember that we can only use this client in server components because the cookies and headers will be only available in server components. The last thing is database type. This type is generated by Supabase CLI, and this part is out of this course, out of this video. If you wonder how you can generate your types based on your database schema with Supabase CLI, you need to check my previous video. And lastly, you need to inject your database types into this server client. Okay, cool. Next thing is creating our browser client. In the same folder, same utils folder, we will create supabase-browser.ts, and we will use create browser Supabase client helper function to create our browser client. And again, we will pass our database types into this client. And we will use this browser client only in client components, because we cannot use this client component since it doesn't know if the user is authenticated or not. We will use this client for authenticating users in client components. For example, in our login page, we use this client because this is a client component. And after we logged in user with this client, we will pass the access token and the other stuff to the cookies, and the server client will recognize the user with those cookies. I hope you understand this process. Okay, cool. Next thing is creating our middleware. Middleware is a Next.js feature. In middleware, actually, when user is navigating before loading every page, this middleware runs. So in this middleware, we are going to be creating a middleware Supabase client. And the reason for this is refreshing user session when the user navigates through our application. Okay, now we can create our context for Supabase and Auth logic. Let's first check our layout component where we pass our context providers. The first provider is Supabase Provider. This provider is creating our Supabase instance and ensure that we have only one single instance for our entire application. And inside this provider, we will have another provider called Supabase Auth Provider. Before diving into this part, let me show you each provider and what they do. Let's start with Supabase Provider. To create this provider, first we need to create a folder called providers in our components. And in this folder, we will create supabase-provider.tsx file. And in this file, we simply create a React context. And in this context, we will expose our Supabase client. The reason for creating this provider, we want to use only single instance of Supabase client, because with this client we will log in or log out user, and we want this client recognize users when they authenticated, which means that if we use this client in our every component, we can now fetch data with our authentication system. For that purpose, first we need to create our context with create context function. And in this context, we will expose our Supabase client. You can get this type from Supabase Auth helper library, and you can pass your database types into it. And to creating a single instance, we need to put our client into a state, and we will expose this state as value of our context. And to use this instance in our context, we need to create a custom hook called use Supabase. And in this custom hook, we will return our context value, which is our Supabase client. And we will wrap our app into this provider, which means that we will have our context in our every component, in our every client component. Okay, cool. Now we need to check our Supabase Auth provider. Supabase Auth provider is a little bit complex than the other provider, because in this provider we will manage the whole logic for our authentication system. In this context, we will expose our user, error, if there is any error, is loading state, the mutate function, and the sign out, sign in with GitHub, sign in with email helper functions. With this context, we don't need to create our sign out function in every component. We can use this single sign out function or sign in functions. Also, we don't need to fetch our user data in every component. We can use this user and the loading state and the mutate function. Okay, cool. First, we need to create our context with this initial value. And after creating our context, we need to create our provider. In this provider, we pass our server session. We will pass this server session from our layout component. This is the root layout component in Next.js 13. To get this server session, we need to use supabase.auth.getSession. Remember that this is a server component. That's why we need to create our client with our Supabase server client, because in this server component we can reach our headers and cookies. When we create our server client, then we can fetch our session. Once we fetch this session, we can pass through our component like server session. Okay, let's go back our provider. In this provider, as you can see, we can also reach our Supabase instance, because in our layout component, our Supabase Auth provider is a child of Supabase provider, which means that we can reach this context in this provider, right? Yeah. So we are using our single Supabase instance in this provider. Also, we will fetch our user data with use SWR hook in this provider, because we don't want to fetch user data in every render, right? We need to cache this data since it doesn't change very often. Also, with the mutate function, we can always refetch this data if it changes, right? To use SWR hook, we need to install like this: yarn add SVR. After finish installing this hook, we can just simply import use SWR from SWR. Okay, cool. After we create our fetcher, we can now pass our fetcher into use SWR hook. But first we need to check our server session. If there is no server session, we don't want to run this hook, because if there is no server session, we can't know which user that we want to fetch, right? Because we are getting the user ID from server session. But if there is a server session, we will fetch this user data from our profiles table. And beyond that, we can create our common helper functions in this provider, because we are going to be using those functions in our every component, right? For example, in our navigation component, we can use our sign out function. That's why we don't want to create this function in every component again and again. Also, we can create our sign in with GitHub or sign in with email functions as well. Okay, cool. The last thing that we need to do is creating a subscription for our Auth state changes. Because when the Auth state change, we need to sync our server session and client session. To make this happen, we simply use the supabase.auth.onAuthStateChange function, and with this function we subscribe to the auth changes. And if there is a change, and if the session access token doesn't equal to server session access token, we need to refresh our router. When we refresh the router, Supabase automatically detect the sessions and sync for us. And we need to unsubscribe from this subscription when the component is unmounted. Okay, cool. Now we can pass our values into our provider. And the final thing is creating a custom hook called use auth. In this hook, we will reach these values in our components. Okay, let's go back to our root layout. In this root layout, as you can see, we wrap our application with these providers and fetch our session in the server component with the server client that we created before. And you need to make sure that this component is only imported in server. To ensure that, you need to install a package called yarn add server only. Yarn add server only. Once you install this package, you can use like that. As you may remember, we use this in our Supabase server instance as well. With this import, Next.js will ensure that this component is only imported in server build. Okay, cool. I think now we are ready to look our components. Let's first check our login form. Login form is a client component where we need to get our client, the browser client Supabase instance, right? In this component, we can use our use auth custom hook, and with this hook we can reach our sign in with email function, sign in with GitHub function, and our user object. And we can pass these functions into our form with handle submit, also into our GitHub button like this with the on-click handler. And we can check if there is a user. We can say to Next.js, please redirect the user to the home page. Let's check if it works. If we click this button, we need to run this server. Okay, cool. Now we can click this button. As you can see, after the user is logged in, we redirect the user to the home page, right? And in our home page, we have a navbar, this navbar. And in this navbar, we can use the custom hook or use auth custom hook with user and sign out. And we can use this sign out function to sign out user like this. It's very cool. Also, as you can see, we are fetching our profile image from the user object like this. And remember this is a client component. That's why we can use our use auth hook, because as you may remember, in this hook we are using our browser client, right? Okay, cool. The last thing that I want to show you is how we can protect our roots with this approach. How we can make sure that only authenticated users can use our protected routes. Let's first check how we secure our data with row-level security. In your dashboard, there is a page called authentication, and in this page, there is a section called policies. In this section, you can find all row-level security policies for each table. For our posts table, we have defined a policy called enable all authors, which means that only authors can reach their posts. We can ensure that if their auth.uid equals author, because we have a column called author in our table, which is linked to our profile table. In our row level security, we simply check if they match. If they match, user can reach their posts. Okay, cool. Let me show you the example. In our application, we have a route called posts, where we can get our posts in this API route. In this API route, we need to create a Supabase client to fetch our data, right? And since this is a server component, like the other server components, because route handlers are server components as well in Next.js 13, we need to create our client with Supabase server that we created before. You remember, right? This Supabase server. Okay, cool. Once we create our client, we can simply check if we have a session. If there is no session, we simply return unauthorized, because we don't want to get users who is not authenticated any data from our application, right? Okay, we can protect our post route like this. If there is no session, you cannot reach our data. Okay, cool. Now we need to fetch our posts for the current user, which means that our current user is the author of the post, right? Okay, now we need to use the user ID for fetching only posts the user is author, like this. And if we can fetch this data, we simply return this data. Let's check. If we call this API route like this, as you can see, we fetch our posts. And now let's try with the unauthenticated user like this. If we logged out from our application and if we try this again, as you can see, we cannot reach our data since we are not authenticated.